So this week's homework is going to focus on the topic of ecology. We're going to cover all of ecology in a very short amount of time, just this 1 week span. So here are all the key terms for the ecology unit. So we first have to begin with defining what is ecology, and that's just the study of how organisms interact with each other, how they interact with their environment, how their environment affects them, etc. And it comes from the Greek terms oikos and logos, which means the study of the house, so the study of how we interact with our home, the environment. And it's a fairly new area of biology when you take into account the field of biology as a whole. So we have to start first by kind of setting some groundwork and setting some terms out there for how we organize life. We're going to do this a couple times throughout the semester. It just helps us be a little bit more specific and clear with our language and allows us to hone in on what exactly we're talking about. So we're going to start with the least complex and get to the most complex in terms of organization. So we start with the individual or the organism. That's like you. That's like one squirrel. That's like one, bee, something like that. A population is now a group of organisms of the same species. So it would be like all of the humans at our college, all of the ash trees at our college, all of the squirrels at our college, things like that. A community then looks at all of the living things in the given area. So it would be all of those species groups that I talked about before. So the population of humans, the population of bees, the population of trees of different species, all of those in a given area. So from this point below, we've talked about what are called the biotic factors, the living components of the ecosystem. Once we hit the ecosystem level, now we're starting to bring in abiotic factors. So these are the non-living components, the nutrient availability, the climate, the sunlight availability, the landscape, things like that. So here we look at the interaction between all of the communities and their abiotic factors around them in a given area. Then we get to the biome level, which is a series of similar ecosystems grouped together. So here are things like the tundra, the taiga, the tropical rainforest, the desert. In Southern California here, we are the chaparral biome. And then we get to the most complex level, which is the biosphere, the whole planet. So at the individual level, ecology is looking at survival, reproduction, things like that. At the population level, we're really looking at population dynamics. How does the population grow or shrink? What are the factors affecting the population's growth and health? At the community level, we're looking at interactions between different species. Ecosystem level is primarily the flow of energy and matter. And then the biosphere, we're talking about global processes like mass extinction events, climate change, things like that. So for this video, we're going to focus on just population and community ecology. So the population, just to be clear, population ecology studies a specific group of individuals of the same species. So it would be all of the pine trees in a given area. Community ecology studies the interactions between the populations of all the living species, all the biotic factors in a specific area. So in this forest of pine trees, it's all the other trees, all the other organisms living in that area. And really, when we look at these two areas of ecology, it boils down to interactions. And organisms are forced to interact because resources are finite. What do I mean by that? So no resource is infinite, meaning there's a limited amount of sunlight in a forest. You have to get to the top or you're not going to get a lot of it. There's a limited amount of water, food, oxygen, space, mates, anything like that. So because there's limited resources, you're going to have two organisms or two groups of organisms that are trying to use the same resource at the same time. And we call that competition. Competition can be intraspecific between the same species. It can be interspecific, where it's between different species of organisms. And there's other types of interactions as well. Competition is just one. There's predation, where one organism preys on the other and eats it. Herbivory is another type of predation, just from an herbivore grazing on a plant. And then there's also symbiosis. Symbiosis is the interactions between two different organisms living in very close physical association, like on or in each other. So let's dive into the three main types of symbiosis. So there's mutualism. This is a close interaction where both of the organisms or all of the organisms involved are going to benefit from the interaction. The example picture here is the cleaner shrimp on a moray eel. Cleaner shrimp will go around to predators, to scavengers, to whoever is out there, and they will clean them. They will eat parasites off of them. So the cleaner shrimp is getting an easy free meal, and the other organism is getting cleaned of any type of parasite or disease-causing organism. It gets all its dead skin removed. Both are benefiting. Pollinator species like bees are also another example. They get a meal. The plant gets its pollen spread from plant to plant. Lichen is another example. This is a fungi and a moss or an algae living together, and they actually work together to break down rock and turn it into soil, which is really cool. Commensalism is an interesting one. This is where the organisms, one is benefiting and the other is neutral. So the one that is getting a benefit is going to get the benefit because of whatever the other organism is just doing naturally. A good example of this is this picture here. When you have large grazing animals like an elephant or cattle, they're going to go around and pull up grass, pull up trees, whatever it might be, and as they disturb the soil, it's going to cause all the insects that were deep in the soil to be brought to the surface. And these birds end up benefiting from this because then they get a free, easy meal. They don't have to work to get any of those bugs. The grazer is doing all that work, and it's not necessarily that they're doing it for the birds. Whether the birds are there or not, they're going to eat and they're going to disturb the soil. The birds are just capitalizing on that. And then you have parasitism. We're probably pretty familiar with this one. It's where one organism is harmed to benefit the other. So the one is getting benefited by harming the other. We know mosquitoes, ticks, we know tapeworms, all that kind of stuff. The cuckoo bird is an interesting one. This is a bird species that lays its eggs in the nest of another species of bird. And the cuckoo bird will hatch first, it will grow faster, and it has these special little spines on its elbows that help it to literally kick the other baby birds out of the nest. So the cuckoo bird is taking advantage of another species to grow its offspring, and they don't have to care for their baby cuckoo bird at all. Another example is the hornworm caterpillar wasp. This wasp will lay its eggs and burrow them into the caterpillar, where the little tiny eggs will hatch, and the larvae will eat the caterpillar and not kill it right away, but it will drain it of energy and resources and harm its body. And then when they're ready, they emerge, they form their cocoons, and then they hatch from their cocoons to be wasps. And usually that whole process will end up weakening the caterpillar so much that it dies. So then we get into populations as a whole here. We're moving away from specific interactions to look at, okay, what effect do these interactions have on the population as a whole? So growth of a population, the population is going to get larger, is going to occur if the births outnumber the deaths, and if immigration outnumbers emigration, if more are coming in than leaving. And then obviously the opposite is true if the population is going to shrink or decline in size. Now, all of this is going to be highly dependent on the resource availability and the characteristics of the environment, and we're going to get into a little bit of that as we go. So an example here, if you see that a prey population like a rabbit is increasing in size due to heavy rains, so there's more grass than there has been in the past, that means that now the predator population is able to grow as well. So they're all kind of feeding into each other here. We're seeing that ecology is quite an interconnected discipline. Now, populations have something called carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of individuals that can be supported in a population by their environment. This is pretty much determined by resource availability. There are other things as well, like interactions with other species in terms of predator-prey or hunting or things like that. But primarily we're talking about they hit the maximum of resource availability for their particular environment. So once a population reaches its carrying capacity, the population is going to stabilize. So the births and the deaths are going to start being relatively equal to each other. So you see here in the graphic, you have reproduction is going to fill the pot. And then things like old age, organisms will die. They're going to potentially lose their habitat. There's going to be development by humans that causes that habitat loss. Maybe there's a weather event that causes some to die or causes there to be extra food available. Starvation, accidents, predation, diseases, all of these things come together, food availability, all of that comes together to determine how much this pot can hold, how many organisms can fit in that environment. So there's two overall models of how populations can grow. The first one is the exponential growth model. So if something's growing exponentially, it means it's doubling every generation. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4, 8, etc. So this is going to occur when a population is not limited by resources. Basically, there's nothing in the environment that's stopping its growth. So this species can grow and grow and grow and grow. So it's going to lead to what we call a J-shaped growth curve, where we just see this increase and it looks like a J. So bacteria do this. The human population is doing this. You often see this kind of growth with invasive species, which we'll talk about a little bit more in class. And then the second model of growth is the logistic growth model. So with this one, you'll see a small population experience early growth, but then as the population grows, the resources are going to become scarce. You're going to start hitting that invisible ceiling that is the carrying capacity. So we're going to end up having slower growth because there's not as many resources. So the deaths are going to start increasing and catching up to the amount of births. And then growth is going to stop when the population hits the carrying capacity, meaning it's going to hover right around that number. It's never going to be, 100 rabbits in this area, and there's never 101, there's never 99. It's going to hover around 100. And so what this does is it creates an S-shaped curve. And most species follow this pattern of growth because for the most part, we don't really live in a world where resources are unlimited. Now, when we talk about logistic growth, what we often see is not such a clean graph as the previous one. You'll often see things like overshoot. Populations will end up accidentally producing way more than what the carrying capacity, this black line, allows. And then you'll see this die off, this crash in the population because they overshot their resources. It's not like the animals or the plants are conferring and saying, well, we can't have any more kids because we're going to run out of resources. They just grow as there is availability, and then all of a sudden we surpass availability, and that causes the die off. We also see instances where the carrying capacity can be enhanced. It can go from 100 to 120, or where it can be degraded. Maybe it was 100, now it can only hold 75 rabbits, whatever that might be. So how does that work? An example would be maybe California gets a huge decade of rain, and we have record amounts of rain every single year for 10 years. So that means more plants are going to sprout, more plants are going to stay alive. That's more food for the herbivores. So we see a huge explosion in the squirrel and rabbit populations in California. So that would be an enhanced carrying capacity. The environment has more food, more resources, so you can have more of your population. Now, another example, what happens if these rabbits end up overgrazing an area. So they find a nice valley, they completely overgraze it, and they can't get out of the valley now because the mountains are too tall or whatever it might be. So because they overgrazed, now there's significantly less grass available for them to eat. So now their population might crash all the way down to only like 50 rabbits instead of 1,000, whatever it might be. So that was a brief look into population ecology, and we're going to switch over really quick to community ecology. And primarily, we're going to talk about succession. This is how communities change over time, the natural, gradual process of predictable changes in the makeup and structure of a community. So the type of species, the number of each population of species, etc. So a succession event will begin when a pioneer species moves into the area. The pioneer species, just like the pioneers in America, were the first to go west and settle. They're the first to come into an area. And then from there, it's going to follow a series of predictable changes from one community replacing another until we get what's called a stable climax community. This is basically like a mature forest, a mature coral reef, a mature chaparral biome, whatever it might be, where that community has reached a point where it's no longer going to be replaced by another community. The community is now stable. And so there's two types of succession that we're going to get into, primary and secondary. For primary succession, this is going to occur in an area that is lifeless or barren, where no soil has existed and no previous community was present. No soil is the key element here. So we're starting with bare rock, and as a result, that can take hundreds to thousands of years for this type of succession event to reach a climax community. This might happen after a volcanic eruption. So a volcano erupts and it creates a blanket of rock in an area, or a volcano erupts on the bottom of the ocean and creates a brand new island. And all of that is just going to be volcanic rock. Or a glacier, those big gigantic sheets of ice, melts and retreats, and it leaves behind this scar where the water had previously crushed the rock and all of the organisms, and you are left with just this bare rock left behind. Or it can be on new sand dunes. So the pioneer species in this type of event are going to be lichens and mosses and fungi, because they can get onto bare rock and start turning it into soil. Nothing else can come in here until we've turned that rock into soil. So you see rock, we get that rock breaking down. Then once we have soil, grasses and herbs and plants and shrubs can come in, and then the trees, etc., stuff like that. So here's just some examples of those pioneer species, and you can see that they're all on different types of rock, and they can break that down. Then there is secondary succession. This is going to occur in an area where a disturbance has damaged or removed existing vegetation, but soil does still remain, and some organisms like bacteria or grasses may still remain. So an example that can lead to secondary succession are things like deforestation, fires, floods, hurricanes, etc. So the pioneer species for this type of succession event are often grasses and herbs, and these will occur over a shorter time frame because there's already soil there to work with. And then there's a couple unique succession events. We often don't think about these, but coral reefs are mature communities. And so if a hurricane blows through, it can disturb and kill the coral. If a bleaching event happens, or you have a big tourist area where the tourists destroy a coral reef, you end up with basically a secondary succession event. If the primary structure is left behind, then it can start to recover, and you'll see that succession occur. Another cool one is a whale fall. This is a deep sea succession event. So when a whale dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and there it's going to create basically a nutrient-dense oasis. And it's going to start with larger predators coming in and eating up the whale's skin and fat and muscle and all of that. And then you get, more invertebrates coming in and kind of picking it clean until there's just a carcass left. And then bacteria will come in and break down parts of the bones as well, and leaving just the abiotic components of the bones behind, the hard calcium part. And then that can serve as a coral reef for future organisms, which is just really cool. So that is it for this video. There's going to be one more for this week, and then we'll get into more details about everything that we've talked about here when we meet on Friday.